Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar for NAA's Diversity and Inclusion Awareness Week entitled Storytelling, an Innovative Approach to Bridging the Parallel Reality of DEI. My name is James Campbell, and I'm the Senior Manager of Industry Relations with NAA, and I want to welcome all of our members in attendance. Thank you for joining us for this very important topic. Before we get started, I want to go over a few housekeeping points. First, this webinar is being recorded and will be posted to our website and YouTube channel next week. You may then share this webinar with those colleagues and friends who are unable to attend at present. Next, we have allotted time at the end of today's presentation for live questions and answers. You may type your questions into the Q&A or chat boxes on your screen at any time, and then we will share them with our presenter. Next slide, please. Now, I am very pleased to introduce our host, Shakora Connor. Voted one of the most influential women of 2020, Shakora continues to make a remarkable impact on the multifamily industry, her local community, and the nation at large. She is driven by the simple yet heartfelt desire to be a light for change. Shakora has been in the multifamily industry for over 20 years and is the CEO and founder of Occupancy Heroes Incorporated. She serves on various NAAEI committees, is a notable trainer, and helps owners increase revenue nationwide. Her maintenance apprenticeship program has trained and employed nearly 600 people since 2018. Shakora is a strong advocate for diversity and inclusion and champions affordable housing. The NAA views Shakora as a source of knowledge. She assisted in the development of the popular D&I webinars and white pages. Shakora was one of 100 entrepreneurs from across the country invited to the White House to advocate for minority entrepreneurship. Shakora established Occupancy Heroes Incorporated in 2003 as the president and founder, and being in property management, real estate, and leasing industry for well over 15 years, Shakora observed several unmet needs in the industry, which is how she developed Occupancy Heroes into a, quote, total leasing solution, unquote, that fosters equity, diversity, and inclusion. Next slide, please. So with that, let me turn this over to Shakora.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for such an important topic. We're going to get started by introducing Miss Brenda Anderson. Miss Brenda is amazing. First off, she is the president and CEO of the Galilee Agency, an organizational development and human performance solutions firm. She is an NRISE instructor for the SBA Emerging Leaders Program, as well as an instructor support coach supporting other instructors in the NRISE network across the country. Brenda is a program facilitator for several supplier, diversity, small business, and leadership development programs. Brenda has received numerous recognitions and awards for her community leadership and work for developing, facilitating initiatives, and speaking on topics related to diversity, equity, and inclusion. She is the author of From Zero to Faith, Real Talk for Real Business. And you can get that on Amazon.com, by the way. And she is a member of the Alpha Lambda Omega chapter of AKA sorority and is a proud B-mom to 5-year-old Amaya and 18-year-old Makai. And with that being said, look, before we go, I just got to say that was a small portion of who Miss Brenda Anderson is. She is amazing. 500, companies, they rely on her. They come to her for her knowledge. She's worked in Switzerland. She's been on covers of magazines. She is just amazing. And you will see what I'm talking about today. So Brenda, with that, welcome.
Thank you, Shakora. Appreciate.
Okay, are you here, Brenda?
I'm here. Can you hear me?
I can hear you now.
Okay, yes. Thank you. So yes, your
Okay.
intro.
Okay, yes, ma'am. All right, so I am going to start with a story. And Brenda, I gotta tell you, I'm gonna tell you a story that happened to me over 20 years ago. And since it happened, I haven't told this story but one time. I haven't even told my children about this story, and I'm very vocal with my children. And that one time that I told this story was right here at NAA on a webinar last year. I told that story because I was sitting on a diversity and inclusion panel and I was asked, why are you here? I had no intentions of sharing that story, but I felt the need to be honest. I felt the need in that very moment to be honest with myself and others. The story is extremely painful to me because I lived it. Every emotion that I felt during that time over 20 years ago flooded my body again when I told that story. And just thinking about it now gives me anxiety. I feel my shoulders tightening up as we speak, and I get a little emotional. But I'm going to tell this story today because it needs to be told. I'm telling this story because it's important and it's necessary in order for us to heal. Storytelling is so important, and it's important for us to understand one another so that we can move forward. So with that being said, I'll tell my story. So I was barely 20 when I started my career as a property manager responsible for 176 units. I went through an intense 3-part interview process and I was finally hired. The Caucasian woman that hired me made it a point to let me know that she was married to a Hispanic man and that she was going to be an ally to me because she understood my struggle. I went through about 3 weeks of training on her property, and then I was placed on a property that was short-staffed, but that was my property. So I was excited. I immediately hired additional staff, and we were producing great results. The owner was thrilled, and so was the company. The company was onboarding several properties in the area, and they began to look for a regional manager. The woman that they hired was nice to me in front of the owners. And when they left, everything changed. On her first official day on property, she terminated a new hire. When he walked in, she told him that he was hired in error and they were not hiring. As soon as he turned to walk away, he didn't even get out the door. She said to me, post a new ad for staff. And then she brought in her own maintenance supervisor. And it was intense. They would fly Confederate flags around the property on their trucks. They were openly racist to me, my staff, and my residents. And this was more or less a low-income community. Amongst other things, I learned that they were stealing appliances. And so I confronted this regional about it, and she terminated me. Well, that's no shocker, right? So I went to the woman who hired me and I told her what happened. And she called the regional and told her that I was there. The regional later called me and told me that she was going to have me arrested for slander and she planned to terminate the remaining staff members if I contacted the owner. Well, I did just that, and she did as promised. She terminated them, and I was arrested the next day for assault. Thankfully, the judge dismissed the case. They threw it out, and I knew then that I had to fight for myself, and I had to fight for my former colleagues. At that time, I contacted the NAACP. I filed a complaint at the EOC office. After weeks of begging and pleading, I finally got my team on board. They knew that we had been wrong, but they just did not believe that we would ever see justice. But in fact, we did. We had a solid case, so solid that we received compensation. The regional and the maintenance supervisor were both terminated. And that is my story.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
20 years ago, and you can still
Yeah.
feel the pain of it.
Yeah. My
And
shoulders
we
are
can even hear it as you told that story.
Mhm.
Why do you think even 20 years later that story has such an impact on you? Why do you think?
Gosh, well, Brenda, I would say that that story, it's one of the reasons why I am who I am today. I've been fighting for diversity and inclusion since the beginning of my career. And that experience showed me that no matter who you are, you can be targeted. It showed me that people can be so battered and bruised and just beaten down to the point that they absolutely have no hope in the system. And it reminds me that I'm a walking testimony of what can happen if you stand up and you fight. So the overall impact that it's had on me is that it's caused me to move differently and see people differently. So the firm that I created is not just about generating profits for owners. It's about being of service to society, creating opportunities for all people and connecting people with homes. And that experience has ignited a fire inside of me that forces me to fight for justice and to not stop until we no longer feel less than because of race, creed, age, gender, and how we identify as human beings. So the situation just reconfirmed for me everything that my parents instilled in us as children, is that we have a voice, we deserve to be heard, and we can all be a vessel for change.
So you felt pain then,
Absolutely.
and you feel pain now, even as you talk about this story.
Yes.
Do
yes.
you think that that regional you talked about felt the same pain?
No.
Okay, all right. So even though you felt pain and both of you shared the same experience,
Yes.
you don't think that that regional felt the same pain that you felt?
No,
right?
ma'am.
So this is what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about this thing called a parallel reality. A parallel reality. If we think back on last year, 2020, I refer to it as the Great Pause. In fact, 2020 kind of held us in place for several weeks and even several months, and gave us an opportunity to reflect on our current reality. We had to look at situations that perhaps, although they had existed in the past, we hadn't paid really close attention to, right? And so what happened is that we began to understand that how we were seeing some of the current reality was being viewed differently by different individuals within our environment, right? So what happened is, in classic example, if we think back of last year in 2020 and some of the significant events that took place, if we remember, there were people who experienced a reality and they branded it and said, Black Lives Matter. And yet on the other side of that reality, there were people who said, well, all lives matter. And what we were experiencing in 2020 reflected that for most of us, the biases that we all have exist in a parallel reality. And the best way I can demonstrate this is by sharing this picture with you. This is Interstate 77, which comes down north-south from Ohio all the way down through South Carolina. And then let's just imagine we're traveling north on Interstate 77, for those of you who are familiar with this particular interstate. And we're traveling north. But what I want you to pay close attention to is the barrier between the north traveling tourists and the south traveling tourists, okay? You may barely make out the top of the cars traveling south on 77. What you do see is the barrier that separates the north traveling tourists and the south traveling tourists. And what may be happening on the north side may be a unique experience that the south side travelers may not experience. The north side travelers may not realize that the south side travelers are experiencing barriers and barricades that detour them off of the freeway. They may not even realize that there are fewer access roads or exits where they can get access to amenities. And so at the end of this journey, those traveling northbound may have no idea of what the southbound travelers were experiencing. And this is what is meant by the parallel reality. And this parallel reality continues to exist as we examine diversity, equity, and inclusion. So as we heard Shakora's story, what we heard was that her experience of what happened was uniquely different than the experience of the regional director. Okay, so that's our parallel reality.
That's amazing. I just love how you explain that, because I think we hear it. I've never seen it like this. To hear it and see it, that's amazing. Thank you for that.
Yes, yes. So what happens is that barrier that you see between the two sides of the freeway or the interstate creates biases for us, okay? And those biases exist whether we accept it or know it, you know. And so what I want you to understand and what we're going to talk about is that the messages we receive in our lives create our biases. And those messages are usually a result of socialization. There are those of us who have what we call explicit biases. They're fully and clearly expressed, readily observable by others. Now, one of the things you heard in Shakora's story was about flying the Confederate flag. That was observable. It was obvious that there was a bias toward, you know, the Confederacy and demonstrating, you know, this flag. And then there are those of us who have what we call implicit biases. They're contained in the very nature and essence of who we are. And many of us may not be readily aware of what those biases may be. Now, one of the things that I always share, we all have biases. Some of them are explicit, some of them are implicit. Now, I don't like using the terminology unconscious bias, because if you read and define the word unconscious, it means that you have very little connection or awareness of your sensories. And so with that, I believe that we may not be aware of our biases, but we have the ability to understand that we have biases. And if you're unconscious, you don't have the ability to understand, you know, your biases. Okay.
But Brenda, let me ask you
Yeah.
this. How do we develop these biases?
Well, I'm glad you asked that question. That's a good question, Shakora. And that leads me into talking about this word diversity. When we look at DEI, the first part of DEI is diversity, okay? And when we define diversity, the first thing I want people to understand is diversity is a state of existence. It exists in anything that we have in life, diversity. And yet what we want to focus in on is what we refer to as cultural diversity. Cultural diversity is defined uniquely different than just saying diversity. Okay, so that's important. I step us back several years to 2005. And at that time, my organization and my consultants and I were doing a lot of work around diversity. We were doing a lot of work, and people were wanting to know, you know, how do we make our environment more diverse, and how do we create an environment for equity and inclusion. And so we were spending a lot of time in organizations helping them to understand that. So one weekend we decided to go off on a retreat and say, listen, if we're going to do this type of work, we've got to have our own definition of what we mean by diversity. And so we began to discuss, well, what does diversity really means for the Galilee Agency? And we spent those 2 days, you know, kind of pulling it apart and really wanting to understand it. And I will tell you that the discussions got very, very heated, very intense. And one of the reasons it got so intense was around this word called race. Around this word called race, okay? I had done a lot of work at the time with an archaeologist. He's 90 years old right now. His name is Dr. Edwin Nichols, and he had been working with the Smithsonian Institute. And I'd also done some work, community work, around a traveling exhibit called Race. And out of that work, what was very clear to me was that there are not different races, okay? They're not different races. Now, I am not blind to the understanding that there are practices that support the myth that there are different races. And we define that as racism, and therefore we define the people who practice that as racist. And yet what my organization defined diversity as the uniqueness of individuals, cultures, relationships, okay? Uniqueness of individuals, cultures, and relationships. And this uniqueness can be reflected in different human attributes, those physical attributes, the color of our hair, the color of our eyes, the color of our skin. All of those are human attributes. There are also differences in our values, our beliefs, our behaviors, orientations, norms, and experiences. Now, what I want you to pay close attention to are the words highlighted in blue: uniqueness, cultures, and relationships. And we're going to kind of pull apart more those words as we define diversity. Again, this is defining cultural diversity, because remember, diversity exists whether we want to accept it or not. What we're looking at is cultural diversity. So let's look at it closer. Franz Tropinars, in his book, Riding the Waves of Culture, introduces us to a definition of culture. And what he says is that it is a way in which individuals or groups of people learn to solve problems and dilemmas in order to survive. In other words, culture is the result of how we've learned to survive. That's how culture evolves. It is how we solve problems and dilemmas in order for us to survive. Now, what he further shares with us is that culture can be understood on 3 different levels. The first level is what he calls the observable level. Okay, it's concrete, it's tangible. It's what we see in our language, hear in our songs, our oral history, our food, our dress, housing, our art, our symbols, our buildings, our statutes, all of those things, our flags, all of those things are observable and tangible. We can see that, right? So from that level, the next thing is that he says, from what we observe, we make certain implications. We imply a certain thing. And those things are usually based on what is normal or what we value. So for example, you see me dressed as a professional, and you may say, okay, she's a professional. You may see me and look at me and say, okay, she's a grandmother, so she may be in this generation, or she may be this age. And I always remind people, try to keep the age generation down a little if you don't mind. But that's an implied understanding of culture based on professionalism. You've heard my bio, you kind of understand also I'm a grandmother, you understand certain things. So as a result, you may make some implications of what may be normal for me and what I may value. But at the heart of culture is this level, or we call the primary level of culture. It is based on the assumption of survival. Now, to help you understand this more clearly, I'm going to tell you a story. Now, remember, I'm a grandmother, and my son, my youngest son, I have 2 sons. My youngest son is the father of my 2 grandchildren. And so when he was much younger, and in fact, in middle school, much, much younger, he had the opportunity to play in a community football league. And unfortunately, his team was not very good. In fact, they had not won any games. And so every weekend we would go out and watch the team play. Now, somehow this child had developed some athletic abilities that I'm not sure where he got them from, but he was pretty decent for, first time going out to play football. So this Saturday afternoon, we're sitting in the stands watching the game, and the score is 3-0. And all of a sudden, near the end of the game, the quarterback threw the ball to my son, who is standing all alone in the end zone. And we're all like, oh, he's going to catch it. Because again, he was a great, receiver here. The ball goes through his hands, right? And we are like, oh, wow. Oh, they could have won the game 6-3. All right. Here's where the cultural understanding comes into play. So as my son is walking off the football field, dejected, kind of head down, the helmet kind of bobbing off around his head, the coach runs out on the field and starts hitting him on his helmet. Boom, 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 boom. Okay. Now I tell the story that I don't know how I got on the football field. I don't know if I jumped over people and out of the stands. I don't know if I ran down the steps. All I know is I'm standing on the football field, eye to eye with the coach. And he's looking at me like, oh my God, why is this parent on the football field? My son, of course, is looking up under the helmet going, I'm so embarrassed, I could die. My mom is on the football field. What I'm sharing with you is the essence of culture, okay? Remember, observable, you see this professional woman. Now, I'm not wearing a t-shirt that says, hit my child and I'm going to beat you up. So you don't know that. But here I am, professional, sitting in the stand, been there watching them lose after game. So the implication is she values her child and she's watching him. So norm is to be there every weekend to support them. What you didn't understand is this fear that my child was being attacked, and in survival mode, I went to defend him. So what we had was a clash of mother culture and football culture, which created a cultural conflict. And this is what often happens because we usually stop understanding culture based on what we can observe and what we imply rather than what we know based on the assumption of survival. So further looking at that, if we look at the core of survival, it is those things that give us an instinct to survive, okay? And Maslow teaches us right off the beginning that we need food, air, water, right, and rest to survive. So instinctually, we know we need those things. Then what happens is we begin to understand that if we don't get those things, bad things may happen to us. Or if we get them, good things may happen to us. And then what starts to happen are we get reinforcing messages about the right way of handling those resources or the wrong way of handling those resources. And so those messages begin what we call the framework of socialization. Those socialization messages begin then to form our norms, our values, and our beliefs. What we know is by the time we're 17, 18 years old, messages we've heard since we have been infants and children have now been hard-baked into creating who we are, how we communicate, the language we use, our preferences, and yes, even our biases. Those biases that we all have. So regardless of what people say, well, I don't have any biases. Edwin Nichols say by the time we're 7 years old, we have very well-defined biases. We have preferences, we have orientations. All of these things create the framework of culture and who we are. And as a result of that, culture shows up on multiple levels. We have gender, age, ethnicity, language, socioeconomic status, national, regional status, physical. If we go back to Shakora's story, she was, managing a housing unit in a low wealth area compared to maybe where the regional director had grown up or experienced. So again, all of those things create different levels of reality for us, as well as cultural differences.
Now, Brenda, how do we identify what those biases are?
Well, what ends up happening is that because of how socialization has created different layers of diversity and differences for us, we begin to understand how biases are formed. And those biases also are formed based on our relationships. Remember those three words I told you to pay attention to. The uniqueness of who we are. If I go back to those circles, each one of us have some unique messaging. Even if you have children, you will find that your children will even be uniquely different based on how they respond to those messages. But one of the things that happens to shape cultural diversity is how we form relationships with other people. And those relationships can also help to shape our biases. So for example, how we view the world, okay? There are those of us who view the world in what we call a universalist perspective, a universalist perspective. We all should get along. We should all, we are all Americans, we should all speak English. Those are universalist messages. And then there are those of us who view the world as being particularists. Particularist relationships are based on specific relationships that we have with specific groups of people. So my relationship with this group of people may be uniquely different than my relationship with this other group of people. So that's how I view the world. It's not just everything is one blanket, but it's based on particular situations or experiences. The second thing that we know is that we develop what we call how I see myself in the world. There are those of us who have been socialized to see ourselves as individuals in the world. And others of us have been socialized to see ourselves as part of a collective. So how we see ourselves in the world may differ. So individualism is the early bird gets the worm. Whereas in a collective orientation, I may say the wood that sticks out will rotten. In other words, if you go outside of the group, you're more exposed to danger than if you stay inside of the group. The other thing is how we respond to the world. There are those of us who are much more neutral in how we respond to certain situations, whereas others have learned how to be much more emotional in how we respond. Oh my gosh, this is such a major thing, whereas other people are like, well, it's not that big, okay? And then the other way we learn how to see ourselves progressing in the world. There are those of us who see ourselves that the more we work, the more we do certain things, we end up achieving. And then there are those of us who believe that because I was born in this country, I deserve certain things. So I am ascribed certain statuses because I am an American. Okay. So those are kind of real brief. And usually when I do webinars, I spend a lot of time going into a lot of, discussion around this, but we don't have time. And these may be some questions that you may want to ask later on in our discussion. But these are core things of how we relate to other people. Then there's how we relate to time. There are those of us who are much more fluid, and there are those of us who are much more controlled when it comes to time. You'll know the difference if you're in any relationship where a person's relationship to time is uniquely different than yours. So for example, if you're the type of person that believes we need to be somewhere at 4 o'clock, exactly at 4 o'clock, and you're in a relationship with someone says, well, if we can get there around 4 o'clock, or if we can get there between 4 and 4:15, that's someone who's much more fluid in their orientation to time. You'll know that because you'll have those conflicts as you're coming out the door. Relationship to time, there are those, to the environment. There are those of us who believe we control the environment. Others believe the environment controls us. So for example, there are those of us who believe if we miss the bus, we say, I missed the bus. There are other people who say the bus left me. Okay. So it sounds, simple, but those orientations create certain biases for us as well as certain conflicts for us. So specifically, they shape our message. And here are some examples. So if I've been socialized around individualism, What's good for me is big success is better. Bad is little success. If I've been socialized around collectivism, small success is good and too much success could be bad for you. If I've been socialized around individualism, it's about I earn the right to do certain things. And what's bad for me is if you're taking my right. So you wonder why we have certain people who are anti-vaxxers or anti-mask wearing, okay? Because in their individualism orientation, it feels bad. It feels like rights are being taken away from them, or the others are imposing upon me. You're taking my independence away and my personal freedom to choose, okay? Whereas on the collective side, it's about the group surviving. And on the bad side of that is if you don't act like the group, then you're being disloyal. All of those things, those messaging shape our biases and creates some of the cultural differences that we have in our environments. So
Okay.
how do we, go ahead. So you have a question?
I have a question for you.
Yes.
So how do we create new realities? How do we do that?
I thank you, because this is exactly where I am right now.
Mhm.
It's why storytelling is so critical.
Mhm.
It's the ability to tell our stories. We must learn how to tell our stories. It's an innovative approach to how we close or we connect our parallel realities. But it begins first with us being aware that we have biases. So it's very difficult if you start telling a story and all of a sudden I'm listening to your story and I'm feeling very uncomfortable. So many of you may have begun to feel uncomfortable with Shakora's story. But if you're not aware of why did I feel uncomfortable with her story? Well, you may need to examine that I have some biases about some of the things that she said, or maybe there were some assumptions that are being made about what she was sharing. So in order to tell your stories or to listen to other people's stories, you've got to first be aware of your biases and your assumptions. The next part of this, if you've got to identify what your values are. What do you value? What are your attitudes around values that don't line up with yours? What are your perceptions, your beliefs, your norms? This is critically important in our ability to tell our stories. You've got to be able to understand, what are my biases? What are my values? And then the next part of that is developing the skills to listen, to listen. You know, it's very difficult to listen to someone else's story or to expect someone to listen to your story if your skills of listening aren't developed. And critical to those skills is the skill of humility. And all humility is saying is, I don't know it all. Remember that parallel highway? I'm going north. I don't know what's happening over here on the southbound.
Right.
Yet I have the humility to listen, to understand the experiences that those individual travelers may have had that I didn't have. Okay. So it's the humility to accept the story that others may be telling. It's always interesting when people start telling their stories and then they start telling you, well, you probably shouldn't have felt that way. You know, remember I asked Shakora, well, how did you feel that way? And it wasn't, well, you shouldn't have felt that way. It's her story, not his story or someone else's story. It was Shakora's story. It's her pain. So my listening to her story, to have the humility to accept what her story is. The next part of this then is how we practice telling our stories and listening to our stories. We must be more intentional in creating access for people to tell their stories. So when Shakora was on the panel last year and had the ability to tell her story, she hadn't told it even to her family, but she had the access and she was included in the panel to be able to tell the story. So practice intentionality of creating access for others to tell their story and to listen to their stories. Include individuals whose stories are uniquely different than yours, whose experiences are different than yours. You may not fully understand their story, but create the practices. And by doing that, you create the opportunity to have more of a panoramic environment of diversity, which also helps you to create the opportunity for equity. So if many of you probably have seen this little cartoon here where you see the equality on one side and equity on the other side. And when you think about equality and equity, you see that the three little boys are all standing on a crate. Well, one little boy, because he's height challenged, he can't see the game. So equity is for the taller boy to give his box so that the shorter boy is able to see the game. So equity is being willing to create access for others to be included, being intentional for that. Now, justice means take the wall down so they all can see it at an equitable opportunity. So when we look at that, then if we are going to bridge the parallel reality of our biases, and remember, folks, we all have them. If we are going to bridge the parallel reality, we have to create an intentional practice where we learn how to listen, where we demonstrate humility, where we create access for others to tell their stories, where we are more intentional of how we listen to other people's stories who are uniquely different than ours. And if by doing that, we can bridge that parallel reality, we can address some of those biases that we all have, and maybe even successfully eliminate some of the things that divide us and keep us on a parallel journey. Okay.
Wow. That, you know what, I have no words, because when we talk about storytelling and the importance of storytelling, I'm up here, I'm looking at the surface, tell me why it's important, but you just went so deep. You went so deep. This is amazing. I see we're coming up on the hour. We've got about 15 minutes or less.
Right.
And I just want you to keep going. But I guess we'll ask, are there any questions?
So can we see?
Okay.
I don't know if there's things in the chat.
Right. Well, you know what? I do have a question.
Okay.
For this. So you talked about cultural differences. I need to know, how do these cultural differences and relationships impact the parallel reality?
Well, as I said, one of the things is that the first thing is being aware, okay? Realizing that we've all been exposed to messages and experiences that create our realities, okay? We all have them. And because of messages that we may have experienced in our lives or heard in our lives, they have shaped who we are. Excuse me, they have shaped our norms, our values, and our beliefs. And as a result of that, we end up in a reality that is uniquely different because of our experiences than maybe the person who sits right next to you or work with you, okay? This is one of the reasons why we struggled with that word race, because what happens is people want to paint everybody, okay, this person is African American, and because they're African American, they've all had the same experiences. And that's not true. We find that within African American, culture, there are multiple layers of culture within that. And so if we just kind of allow that story to be told, then we certainly won't understand the culture of the individual that may be sitting next to us, who may be African American or who may be of another ethnicity, unless we go down into that basic assumption of survival. Remember when I ran out on the football field and embarrassed my son, who didn't speak to me for the whole weekend? You know, when
Understood.
yeah, when you realize that, culturally, that created, a parallel, because as a parent who wanted to protect their child, my assumption was based on survival, whereas the football coach was at a level of observing that my son was feeling dejected, of not being able to catch the ball. And so we were at a different place as it relates
Right.
to culture. And so as a
Right.
result of that, we were not seeing eye to eye as far as what was the reality of what was happening.
Got it.
Mhm.
Now, we've got a question from Derek Buckman. Derek says, what are some strategies in developing intentional practice? What does this look like within an organization?
Very, very good. Very good question. And I get this a lot. One of the things is being aware. That's the first thing. When you walk into an environment or you're in an environment and you look around and you just kind of survey the environment and say, is everybody in the room probably having some of the same experiences or have had the same experiences that I've had? And so rather than, and this is one of the things that I really encourage people to pay attention to, rather than starting at this kind of what I call institutional level, where you're going to invite someone to come in and speak because their experience is uniquely different than everybody else's. Okay. So you're going to just say, we're going to bring somebody in because they're unique. It's best to start with people who you feel the most comfortable that you can start telling each other stories. So the first thing is to start with what I call interpersonal practices, where maybe, start with small groups of bringing people together and say, we're just going to spend some time talking and getting to know each other, not on the surface, down here. What's important, what makes you feel uncomfortable? And then, teaching people how to listen, because people are going to share things that I may feel very offended, by. I've been in meetings where people have said some very offensive things. And, I could just get very defensive and say, oh, no, you shouldn't say that. And yet it's important for me to listen to their story. Their story is their experience. And the only way I'm going to be able to help them in that situation is that I've got to first be able to listen and acknowledge that that's their story. You cannot change what you do not acknowledge. So being intentional, start on the interpersonal level rather than trying to do what I call the organizational or the institutional level. Start on the interpersonal level of just talking with each other in smaller groups. That would be my first recommendation for intentional practice.
That was a great answer. We have Marta Butler. Marta said, what are your strategies or best practices to bring about awareness?
The first thing, and interesting enough, we have an awareness assessment. And some of the questions we ask people, like, how do you feel being around people whose values are different than yours? Okay, so that's just a question. No one gets to see your answer but you. It's important that you answer it honestly. It's like, well, how do you feel about that? How do you feel when you're in an environment where perhaps your uniqueness is the only uniqueness in the room? Ask yourself that. So beginning with an awareness or a self-awareness assessment of some things that you can just practice by asking yourself, well, first of all, what are my biases? List them down. What are my biases? What are the things that make me uncomfortable? What things do I know I feel uncomfortable around? And then list them down, because if you don't know what your biases are, you won't know what what's making you uncomfortable. And on the other side of that, list down your values. We do a value exercise where we ask people to narrow down to their top 3 values. because, you may say, well, I value all of these things. Well, get down to the top 3, because those are the things that gets down to the assumption of survival. Those are the things you're going to defend to the end. And so it's important that you start there.
Very good. I just want to point out Kara House, she is on the D&I committee. She said, love that distinction and call for accountability. Thank you for that, Kara. And thank you for all that you do. We've got so many questions and comments. Let's see. How do you move forward after the storytelling while someone is listening, humble and aware of their biases, may still live in their own parallel reality? Good question.
That's an excellent question. One of the things that intentionality says is that you are ready. You are ready to make some type of effort or change, or you are committed, or you value the opportunity to be in an environment that values diversity, cultural diversity, equity, and inclusion. What I do, when I go with organizations, when I work with individuals, the first thing I'm going to do is what I call a readiness assessment. I'm going to determine if the individuals or the organization is ready to move, because unless that individual is committed to it. So I'm going to listen to your story. And yet when I hear your story, I'm not committed to being intentional in my practice, then you're just not ready. And so you've got to accept when people are ready and when they're not ready. You can't force people to be ready. And so you can shape certain things, certain policies, and you can say, in our organization, we are going to value cultural diversity. We're going to embrace equity. We're going to embrace, inclusion. And if this is not an organization that you're going to feel comfortable in, then perhaps maybe this is not the right organization for you. And you got to be willing to accept the risk of people leaving because they're not ready. They're just not ready. And that's reality. I have been doing this type of work for over, almost 40 some years. And what I have found is that it doesn't matter how many policies you put in place, how many things procedures you put in place, how much training you do. If people aren't ready to make the commitment to change, they're not going to do it. They're not going to do it.
Now, Brenda, I've got to get this question out because we need to hear this. This is from Laura Harold. Now, I know it's 2:52, so we're running. All right. We want to encourage our associates to be comfortable being uncomfortable when it comes to discussions with hard truths related to diversity. Of course, we want everyone to listen and respect one another. However, we are still hesitant because they are afraid of getting in trouble for speaking their truth at work, right?
Right.
Tell us what to do.
It's one of those things that, again, being ready. Okay. Is your organization ready for this? Okay. Because if your organization isn't ready for the consequences, then it may not be time for you to move forward. One of the things that I would encourage you to think about is, having, there are certain inventories out there that you can do. And one of the ones that I promote is the intercultural development inventory. And what it does, it looks at individual readiness and it looks at organizational readiness. Now, so what happens is there's a kind of a level of readiness. So there are some people who are just not ready, and you need to be aware of that. And and get comfortable. So if I know that I speak my truth, and the other thing is education around helping people to understand why they may have that truth. When I know, okay, like you'll hear people say, well, I grew up in an environment and this is all we heard. People using that type of language or people saying those type of things. That's all I heard, and so, I don't know how to look at it any other way. Well, that's their truth. And so we've got to get other people understanding that if we're going to allow people to tell their stories, it's their stories, not, if Shakora's pain was not my pain, it was her pain. It's her story. So whatever story is being told, we've got to get people prepared to be able to listen and accept that story.
That's right. Now, I do have to say this because I know James is probably going to come on and shut us off any minute now. You guys, listen, we all need help. I have had a D&I program within my organization. It's going on 3 years now. We have to constantly educate ourselves, constantly, right? Everything changes, nothing stays the same. So, and I felt like I knew a lot, right? Because I was feeling it. So I thought I knew, but I'm glad that we brought this program in. I'm actually contacted with Miss Brenda Anderson on some things. And Brenda, I need you to put your information out there because I get phone calls all the time saying, hey, can you speak? Can you help me? Talk to me about D&I. What can you do? This woman is amazing. So if you would just give your information and you guys write it down, because even if you don't need it now, you'll probably need it later. Okay.
Okay. I'll put it in the chat.
And she, again, is with the Galilee group. And James, I think you're going to come on and take over.
Yes, ma'am. Well, thank you very, very much, both Shakora and Brenda Anderson, Shakora Connor, for excellent webinar. I'm sure, just judging from the thoughtfulness of the comments and the chat and question, that you've really raised some important topics and given us all a lot to think about. Much appreciated. So what's next in this NAA D&I Awareness Week? Well, tomorrow there'll be another informative webinar entitled, So You Want to Be an Ally? Our presenter will be Marcy French, Vice President of Operations with HRG Management Services. It will be held from 1 o'clock to 2 o'clock in the afternoon Eastern. And just note that all the other webinars in this weekly series are taking place at 2. This one's different. It's taking place an hour earlier. And you are absolutely welcome to join us once more. You're also welcome to visit our webpage, which is /DI Week. And there you will find a series of challenges and actions where you can share your own D&I experiences in the workplace. Next slide, please. So with a hearty thank you, again, I wish to thank everyone for participating. Special thanks to Brenda and Shakora. Thank you to our audience. We value your membership and appreciate your attendance. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you so much, Shakora, for being a great hostess. And thank you to the National Apartment Association for the opportunity to spend this time with you. Thank you very much.
Absolutely. Thank you. We so appreciate everyone for being here. This is so important. The next one coming up is Marcy French. Marcy is amazing. If you missed her in Chicago, don't miss her this time around. She's amazing. Thank you, guys. Bye.
Bye.